Good afternoon. We're going to get going with our program now, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon and welcome to City Club Missoula's August Forum, where our featured speaker is U.S. Senator Steve Daines. My name is Peggy Coor, and I serve this year as chair of City Club Missoula. One of the first things I'd like to do is thank our many sponsors. We have a number of representatives of our sponsoring organizations who come to every City Club, and we want to thank you and your organizations for the generosity and the support. The names rotate on the screen, so please give them a thank you as well. It really helps with the City Club mission. I have a small housekeeping item, which is there should be name tags at the center of every table. So if you're not already sporting one, please take a name tag. It helps when we get to the discussion part of the forum today. I do want to mention today City Club's mission. Our mission is quite simple. It is to bring people together to inform and inspire all of us as citizens on issues important to Missoula and our surrounding community. How we do that is through public forums like this one that really encourage discussion of new ideas and free exchange of thought. In short, we encourage civil dialogue on issues of big civic importance. A word about our format. After the Senator's presentation, as we always do at City Club, we then adjourn for table talk, and that means that each of your tables will have about 10 minutes to discuss what you've heard in the presentation. We ask that each table come up with one question from the table, and you'll need to designate a spokesperson, and then when we reconvene, we will have one question from as many tables as we can get through given our time constraints. I do have one more important item before I make the introductions, and that's my ad for the next forum, which is on September 9th, Monday, September 9th. At that forum, we'll have a discussion on the University of Montana's recruitment and enrollment work. That will feature several people from UM, and it will be headlined by the Vice President for Enrollment and Strategic Communication, Kathy Cole. So we want to put that word out a month ahead of time. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our guest, and I'm going to do it a bit by the numbers, but I have to start first with the competitive part. As we know, or you may not know, but the Senator did go to college on the other side of the mountains at that university, and he's not wearing blue and gold, for which I'm thankful. I don't see any maroon, but we can work on that. But indeed, he did earn a Bachelor of Science degree from Montana State University in chemical engineering. Now comes the lucky number 13, as in 13 years in management positions with Procter & Gamble, including 6 of those years in Asia, in China, as I understand, and in Hong Kong. He returned to Montana in 1997, and in the year 2000 joined Bozeman-based Right Now Technologies. Many of you have heard of that cloud computing startup, which was sold to Oracle in 2012. 2012 was the year that Steve Daines ran for the U.S. House seat for the state of Montana and was elected to that position. And in 2014, he was elected to the U.S. Senate, where he has served since early January 2015. He serves on these Senate committees: Finance, Appropriations, Energy and Natural Resources, and Indian Affairs. And now I don't want to ignore the personal numbers, as in 5, which is 5th generation Montanan. 32, as I understand, number of years he's been married. 4 children, and lest we forget, 1 new grandchild. And with that, I'm going to introduce and welcome Senator Daines to the table for remarks.
Appreciate it a lot. I think I've got a lapel here. Is that lapel working okay?
Yes.
Great. Well, thank you, Peggy. Thank you for the warm introduction and for the numbers. We are thrilled to be grandparents Little Emma Ray was born January 26th, and she got to spend some time with Grandma in Bozeman here this last week. It's a pleasure as well to be with Mayor Kemmis sitting next to him today with his service back in the 90s. Thank you for serving Missoula as well. Always get to meet sometimes names you've heard of in the past. You get to see them face to face. Mayor, thank you. Some of you might know early days were actually here in Missoula before I was born. My mom was pregnant with me, putting my dad through school here, working at the Missoula Merc once upon a time. And my mom and dad met. My dad literally married the girl next door in Billings, and then he joined the Marine Corps and came here to Missoula to go to school. Mom became pregnant. Mom kept working there at the Missoula Merc. And my dad drilled as a Marine and was a Sigma Chi brother of two other Montanans I think you've probably heard of here in Missoula and probably all over Montana. One was a guy named Bobby Houck Sr., who I understand he produced a son. The Houcks, of course, moved to Big Timber, and then Bob Houck was a legendary coach here in Missoula. Another was named John Bollinger. John, of course, was Brian Schweitzer's lieutenant governor. In fact, John Bollinger and my dad were at the same high school, Billings Senior, once upon a time, back in the late 50s. And so, and yes, Peggy, I am a Bobcat. In fact, I think I'm one of the first, if not the first Bobcat to serve in the House and the Senate. Now, Grizzlies have done a lot of that in the past. And I remember I had one time a Grizzly came up to me and said, "How come it took the Bobcats so long to get to the House and the Senate there?" And I said, "Well, I think most Bobcats are too smart to run for Congress. Maybe that's the answer." So, but growing up in Bozeman, Mom and Dad moved back to Montana in 1964 when I was a year old. My dad couldn't find a job in Montana when he was getting ready to graduate. Written all these letters all over, and like a lot of Montanans, you get displaced for a temporary period of time for economic reasons. Mom and Dad moved back in 1964, I'm a year old, to Bozeman. Of course, it was a little town back then, I think 12,000, 13,000 people once upon a time. And, going to kindergarten through, grade school at Longfellow School there on South Tracy, one of the old elementary schools in Bozeman, then Bozeman Junior High, Bozeman High School, Mohawk, and then a Bobcat. I thought I knew Montana really well because I'd get all over the state, family vacations. My cousins built the Viking Lodge up in Whitefish that got replaced by the Whitefish Lodge now. Some of you might remember the old days of the Viking on Whitefish. Maybe in eastern Montana, honey antelope. But it wasn't until I became your congressman and then your senator, where in that role, you literally get to every corner of this great state. And in fact, I do a 56-county tour every Congress, every 2 years. You can go on my website, daines.senate.gov. You can slice it any way you want by the years. You can see where I was during that year. And there'll be dots all over that map with a picture and what we did in that particular community. But I will tell you just in the last 10 days, during this August work period, here are my last 10 days. It was Missoula, and I'll tell you a little about the meeting I had here in Missoula just earlier, 10 days ago. Hamilton, Ronan, Whitefish, Billings, Red Lodge, Bozeman, Helena, Butte, Deer Lodge, Baker, Miles City, Glendive, Scobie, Plentywood, and then I'm back here in Missoula today. I was in Plentywood and Scobie on Friday, up there in that corner of our state. I guess I'm glad I was up there on Friday. I understand, boy, we had a horrendous storm go through central and eastern. You got it here in Missoula too, I understand. Right, great big golf-size hailstones. But what you see when you go to all these different corners of Montana multiple times is the diversity of our state. There is no one community, there is no one county that defines Montana precisely. It is really looking at what happens in all 56 counties. And as I go back to Washington, D.C., sorting through policy, thinking about how to vote on a particular issue, and trying to take everything you hear back home and bring that back to Washington. You may not know this, but I was actually ranked in the last Congress as the most bipartisan and effective member of the Montana delegation. In fact, I was very honored to, in my class of 2014. When you elected to the United States Senate, you're referred to as a class. It's like who the new freshmen are. It's like your college freshman class or your high school freshman class when you enter maybe the high school or college. Our freshman class in 2014 were 12 senators from all over the country. In last Congress, I was ranked as the most bipartisan effective of my class. We also was honored to receive an award. I'm sharing these things with you because when you read and watch and listen to the news today, it's a message of the polarization that's going on in Washington and the divide that's going on in our nation. And I don't want to minimize the polarization and the divide. That's real. But there's also a lot of bipartisan work that gets done every day back there. Not enough of it, but it gets done back there. And I received an award just a few weeks ago as the most transparent, accountable, and innovative senator in the entire U.S. Senate. And by the way, they redact the name when they do that award. I didn't even know that. I showed up at an award breakfast, and they picked one Democrat and one Republican, one from the House and one from the Senate. And I received that award most recently. And they don't know who they're giving the award to because, again, the information in the member's name is redacted. You'd probably be surprised that I got a bill passed with Kirsten Gillibrand. Now, you may not know who she is, but she is a dear friend of mine. She's a senator from New York. She replaced Hillary Clinton in New York when Hillary became the Secretary of State. And Kirsten and I think very differently on a lot of issues. When you're a Democrat from New York, you probably think a little differently than a Republican from Montana. We represent different constituents. We worked together and we got the Blue Water Navy bill passed together. And we had the help of John Tester on the VA committee as well. The ranking member, Johnny Isaacson is the chairman, he's from Georgia. John Tester is the ranking member from Montana. And we got it done. It was a very important bill for our Navy vets, Blue Water vets who served in Vietnam, who were exposed to Agent Orange. And frankly, an injustice of the VA that was not allowing these veterans to get the benefits they deserved, similar to what those people that served on land would receive. You might be shocked to hear I have a bill right now with Elizabeth Warren. Now, everybody's probably heard of Elizabeth Warren. She's doing very well right now in the presidential run. Elizabeth's office was right next to mine. We had a bill. I'm a Democrat from Massachusetts, a Republican from Montana, working on a bill here to create a database to help 401ks and retirement accounts sometimes get displaced because the nature today in work, because people are moving around from job to job a lot more frequently. And we wanted to make sure we help people retrieve some of these missing, believe it or not, sometimes, smaller accounts. You might be surprised that right now I'm actually working with Dianne Feinstein, the senior senator from California, Democrat, with a Republican from Montana on forest management. Why is California concerned about forest management right now, like we are here in Montana? Look what happened last year in California. Dianne grabbed me on the floor, the Senate, just before we broke for the August work period. And she said, Steve, we lost 15,000 homes in California wildfires. We had over 80 people died in wildfires last year. We've got to do something. And California's gotten to a point where Governor Newsom, their former mayor of San Francisco, now the governor of California, has had to take extraordinary action to suspend some regulatory reviews to expedite some treatment projects there in California in their forests because they're in a dire situation. So Dianne has been a great partner. We sent a letter 3 years ago to respective committee chairs asking for their help to get relief. And I'll talk more about what we're trying to do here in forest management with Dianne Feinstein. But you might not find it intuitive based on what you read sometimes back here in Montana. The U.S. Senators working with Gillibrand and Warren and Feinstein on important legislation. You might have heard a couple months ago now when they announced the Job Corps site cuts, the one for Anaconda. That was one of 9 Job Corps sites that was on the chopping block to be shut down. They also were going to take the Trapper Creek Job Corps and move it from the Department of Agriculture to Department of Labor, which I think is a big mistake because it's no longer going to be a CCC. Those of you who are familiar with the Job Corps know the incredible value they bring. I heard that news, and there were some folks that said, there's no way you actually called President Trump. You know what? I did, and on this phone right here. I literally called him up. I said, Mr. President, you have a couple of secretaries in labor and ag that have made a recommendation that I disagree with. And here's why. Here's why. The Anaconda site, do you know, is ranked in the top 10% of all the Job Corps in the country. I said, why in the world do you want to shut down one of our top performing Job Corps? And these Job Corps, as many of you know, from firsthand experience, many have friends, know about what they produce, is they'll take youth, these young people, and give them skills that we need right now. One of the great concerns I hear across Montana as well is we can't find enough people to fill the jobs out there. Well, they do that. They work with the unions and apprenticeships and so forth, supplying skilled labor here, as well as giving these young people another shots. Literally heard testimonies. I went down there and gave them the good news about men and women who have been struggling with drug addiction, some who had been in jail and prison, and the Job Corps gave them a new lease on life. It is a lot more cost-effective to invest in the Job Corps than incarceration at the other end. And I called the president up, laid that argument out. He says, Steve, I agree with you. We're going to keep Anaconda open. And in fact, they ended up keeping all 9 of those Job Corps sites open.
All right.
On the issue of conservation, very important here in Missoula and across Montana. I'm a lifelong fisherman and hunter. In fact, my wife and I, we're going to get 3 days next week during the August break period. We're headed to the Beartooth. That's where we go usually every summer. I've been a student of the Beartooth since I was in junior high school, chasing cutthroats, sometimes goldens, in high-altitude lakes with an elk hair caddis. One of the great compliments I had one time from a paper up in northwest Montana, they called me the conservative conservationist. I was grateful for that. You realize just earlier this year, we passed one of the most significant land packages that we've seen come across the president's desk in probably a decade or even 2. We permanently reauthorized the Land and Water Conservation Fund. Let me tell you where that was at. At the end of last year, at the end of that Congress, we were 1 vote short of getting it moved through unanimous consent. When you want to do unanimous consent, you got to score 100-0 in the Senate. It's a tall order. If just 1 senator objects, you can't get it passed. And guess what? We were 1 senator short. Almost got it done. And remember, we had late-night conversations with this particular senator. He just wouldn't budge. So we knew we weren't going to get it done in the last Congress. But as we were wrapping up before we broke for Christmas, we grabbed Chuck Schumer and Mitch McConnell, Nancy Pelosi, as well as Kevin McCarthy. Now remember, there was a change in power going on there because the speaker was Paul Ryan, but the Democrats won the House. So we knew we had to be talking to Nancy Pelosi. She was going to be the next Speaker of the House, most likely. And they committed to us to giving us an up or down vote on this land package within the first 60 days of the new Congress. I can tell you something from my experience, lands packages typically aren't the first few bills that go out in a congressional period. Oftentimes they're done in the lame duck session, like we were trying to get it done during the Christmas period last year. It permanently reauthorized LWCF. Why is that important? There's a lot of reasons. I won't get into every detail here, but you realize 70% of the fishing accesses here in Montana are funded through the Land and Water Conservation Fund. In the checkerboard nature of the way land ownership works in Montana, we have a state section, a federal section, a private section, trying to find ways to consolidate that, to get access oftentimes to more public lands has been a way that the LWCF funds are used. But having permanent reauthorization was very important because up until that point, you had to wait for Congress to reauthorize it. And that uncertainty was hurting us in our ability to execute these longer-term land transactions needed sometimes Land and Water Conservation Fund funds. Well, as I said, it says it took public lands to bring divided government together. And we got that passed. When I first came back to Congress, I remember a story on Max Baucus. When I was at Boy State in 1979, Went to Dillon. How many of you have been to either Boy State or Girl State? Back, once upon a time, it was at Dillon, right? Now, of course, it's in Helena. But back when it was in Dillon, I was down there, and a brand new elected U.S. Senator showed up. I was a junior at Bozeman High School, soon to be a senior. And he showed up to be our speaker. His name was Max Baucus. Remember, he won that election in 1978. So here we are in 79, his first year in office. And I'd known Max since I was a kid, like most people in Montana. They're the guy that walked across Montana. In fact, Max walked into City Hall when Max first ran for Congress back, I think it was 74. And my dad was pulling a building permit in downtown Bozeman. Let me tell you, Bozeman was very, very different back then. Small town. And this guy walked in and said, "Hi, I'm Max Baucus." My dad said, "I'm Claire Daines. I'm pulling a building permit." And Max said, "I'm running for U.S. Congress." So now you fast forward. Max had been working on, with Conrad Burns in a bipartisan fashion, the Heritage Act. Some of you know about that. That was expanding some wilderness areas on the Bob, along the Rocky Mountain front. It was also designating some recreation areas and conservation areas there. Very important. It was going on for years. And it was working when I was in the House. It was just the right chemistry, because it was going to take a Republican in the House, because back then the Republicans had the House. That was John Boehner as Speaker. And it was Harry Reid in the Senate. So with Baucus and Tester in the Senate, Daines in the House, it was the right combination to get that bill passed. It was some of the first wilderness area designations in a couple decades for the state of Montana. We also passed the North Fork Act, which was a mineral withdrawal up there, hard rock, on the North Fork of the Flathead. If you love Glacier Park, I'm guessing there'd be uniform head nodding on Glacier Park. That's an incredible important part of the North Fork there, just on the west boundary of Glacier National Park. We got that moved through. We got the wild and scenic designation for the East Rosebud done here as well recently. Now, familiar with the East Rosebud, that's kind of over on my side of the state, on the Bozeman side, south of Fishtail. That's getting a little bit detailed here. Zorkey, down there in Stillwater County. But we got that passed. We got the Yellowstone Gateway Act passed. That took a couple of bips and bobs and zigs and zags, but that was an important withdrawal. And literally the back door of Yellowstone National Park, protecting the Yellowstone River, where I was fishing on Saturday. Had a great day fishing on Saturday. Fly fish from, most likely we put in and took out at 2 fishing access sites that were funded by Land and Water Conservation Fund, by the way. Another recent win, by the way, we had is you realize I'm the first senator in 75 years to serve on both the Appropriations Committee and the Finance Committee. We got e-file passed. You know what that means? Is that up until getting e-file passed for the Senate, when senators were running for Congress, for re-election or first-time election in the Senate, they only had to file paper reports. The House had to file electronically, but for some reason the Senate never had to file electronically. It just allows that information to get to the public faster. I think it was an important step in transparency. And I put that specific rider, because I was a chairman of the subcommittee, to get that passed, e-file provision, just in the last Congress. A couple months ago, probably been 3 months ago now, I was here in Missoula, did a round table with your law enforcement here. Missoula County Sheriff was there, Missoula Police Chief, 4 other county sheriffs in western Montana. We had the HIDTA Drug Task Force and the DEA folks here, and we talked about what's going on with meth here in western Montana. You realize what's happening right now with violent crime here in Missoula, up 49%. Violent crime. You talk to law enforcement and say, why is violent crime up here in Missoula? Why is petty crime up in Missoula? Why are all sources of crime up? And not just in Missoula, but in most communities in Montana. There's one answer to that. It's called meth. This meth is destroying families and communities across Montana. Now, once upon a time, the meth that came to Montana was homegrown meth. It was, you took Drano and Sudafed. It's a horrible thought. And you made it homegrown. That's why you see the pictures with meth addicts. They'd have the rotten teeth and the sores. They called it meth mouth. Well, guess what? We don't see meth mouth much anymore. Do you know why? Because once upon a time, that meth was homegrown here in Montana. Today, it's meth coming from Mexico, from Mexican cartels, and the purity is no longer 25%, it's 95% pure. So it no longer is corrosive to the mouth because it's so pure, but it's far more addictive. And the price of meth has dropped, the distribution has increased, and it's coming right out of Mexico. This has to be addressed. I brought Vice President Pence to Montana a couple of months ago. I wanted him to see firsthand what's going on here in Montana. We went to Billings. But I also wanted him to see the hope that we have as we treat Montanans who are dealing with addiction. Now, on an issue as complicated as meth, there's no one silver bullet. In fact, Angus King, the senator from Maine, is a good friend of mine. In fact, I chair the National Parks Subcommittee in the U.S. Senate. Angus is the ranking member, former governor of Maine. He said, Steve, you know, oftentimes these complicated issues, there's no such thing as a silver bullet. Rather, it's silver buckshot. I thought that's a great way to think about it. We've got to work on multiple fronts on this issue of meth. Not a lot of moving parts to it. But on the addiction side and recovery side, there's some tremendous organizations here in Montana who are helping meth addicts. One that comes to mind is the Rimrock Treatment Center in Billings, where they take moms who are dealing with meth addiction and they work in a residential kind of setting to work them to get them better. I had Vice President Pence sitting at a table not unlike this with 3 moms and their children on their laps, all giving their story of hope and recovery. In a piece of legislation that I passed in the last Congress, we passed a major drug bill. Dealing with opioids was kind of the lead on this drug bill because the opioids has been the struggle right now in northeast United States and coming across the Rust Belt. But the voice of Montana had to be heard in this discussion because our issue here in Montana, well, we have an opioid problem. We have a meth crisis. And so we had to put some provisions in that bill to deal with meth. So we make sure that Montana's voice was heard there. And I was able to get a provision put in there that allowed moms to keep their children with them when they're going through treatment. Because when we're dealing with a meth-addicted mom here, and by the way, the Rimrock folks told me that once upon a time the number one addiction issue they had with moms was alcohol. They told me today it's methamphetamines. So you allow the children to be with the moms. That was the bill the provision I got put in the bill and was signed by President Trump. Because it's that accountability for those children that keep the moms going in the program and gives them hope to get better. And the Vice President got to hear about that. Well, there's a lot of work left to be done, as I mentioned. On the forest management side, working with Diane Feinstein. In fact, I was on that Helena fire. You saw that one that nearly broke to 5,000 acres. We had some guys out there shooting tannerite. That was the ignition source. What Diane Feinstein and I have found looking at the science is that over 90% of fires that are human caused start within a half a mile either side of a road or a trail. So one of the provisions we have in this bill is to expedite treatment thinning projects when they're within a half a mile either side of trails and roads. Had we had that in place, that Helena fire probably would have been stopped when it was at 100 acres, not growing to 5,000. Because the problem, of course, we have is, you know, we have all that fuel that builds up on the forest floor because of lack of forest management. What happens then is when you do have an ignition source, then by the time they get your first attack to that fire, it's already spread a couple hundred acres, and then you've got yourself a wildfire. We probably could have stopped that had we had this bill signed. So it was just kind of rewarding to see, okay, here's a case study on that as working that with Diane. So that's something when I go back to Washington in September, Diane and I are hoping to introduce that bill. It'll be a good bill for Montana, it'll be a good bill for California, and for the West. On the conservation front, we're going to keep working here on getting the full funding for Land and Water Conservation Fund. That's at a number north of $900 million. So LWCF was funded about $425 on the Appropriations Committee. John Tester and I are on the Appropriations Committee, by the way. That's a great thing for Montana. Do you realize we have a Republican and a Democrat on the Appropriations Committee? So you can work in a way here. Montana gets 2 votes on the Appropriations Committee, and that's not a bad thing. And we can bring that voice here for something of the Land and Water Conservation Fund. So we want to get to the $900 million. We got the permanent reauthorization done. And thanks to so many of our conservation groups that are out there helping us on this, with the full support of the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, TRCP, many other conservation groups here that have big presence here in Montana, we're making progress. Now, $900 million is the summit. I wrote a letter with support from Rocky Mountain Elk and TRCP to get up to $600 million. That's like going on, if you're climbing Everest, we got to Camp 4, let's get to Camp 5, we got to get to summit here. We want to keep moving up the mountain here. So we got it permanently authorized, want to move it up 40%. That's a significant increase. On our way to get the full funding for the Land and Water Conservation. But that's going to take bipartisan cooperation. It takes some time. But I'm confident we're going to get there. Another important bill is the Restore Our Parks Act. I mentioned I'm the chairman of the National Parks Subcommittee, which serves under the Energy and Natural Resource Committee that Lisa Murkowski is the chairman of. Joe Manchin is the ranking member. Do you realize our national parks have about a $13 billion backlog in deferred maintenance? That's with a B. And I think some of these numbers are a little bit low. In fact, I was speaking with Cam Shawley, the new superintendent of Yellowstone National Park here recently. I think we're probably understated by a significant amount. Cam's going to up his numbers, no doubt. But this is about the deferred maintenance. This is about some things that oftentimes are not always top of mind when a visitor comes to our national parks. They may not be worried about the employee housing, the sewer treatment systems, the water systems, of course parking lots, and other infrastructure that are in disrepair. And Angus King said, Steve, I think about deferred maintenance as debt. We're carrying this debt right now in our national parks. We need to true that up. So we're working to get bipartisan support, which we have. In fact, in my committee there, we've got Mark Warner, a Democrat from Virginia. Got, of course, Angus King, Democrat from Maine. And then I've got Rob Portman, Republican from Ohio, Lamar Alexander, Republican from Tennessee, and I chair the committee. And we're working to get this bill through committee and on the floor of the U.S. Senate for an up or down vote. The president has indicated he will sign it if we can get it to him. That'd be a big deal. In fact, I just did a field hearing last week. Do you realize you can do field hearings outside of Washington, D.C.? That's the definition of a field hearing. They're the same weight and magnitude of a hearing you might see on C-SPAN when you're watching a hearing or going back to Washington, D.C. You have the same recordings, the same protocol, same parliamentary procedures, but you have them in the field. And so I did one at the Grant Coors historic site. If you've been to Grant Coors there outside of Deer Lodge, how many have been there? Just curious, have been to Grant Coors? That is one of the best kept secrets in Montana. They get about 27,000 visitors a year right now. I highly encourage you, next time you're driving between Missoula, maybe to Bozeman, or wherever you're headed, if you're just headed to the east, you'll see the sign there that says Grant Coors. It's one of those Brown National Park sites. It's one of our 10 sites here in Montana that fall in the jurisdiction of the National Park System. It's an old working ranch. Still have the beaver slides for hay. See the jack fences there. It kind of feels like the Big Hole a little bit when you're over there. But it's a hidden gem. So we had a field hearing there. In fact, I think somebody says the first time there's been a field hearing for the United States Senate, perhaps in a barn, which we did. So that was so we got a lot of testimony out there and put that. It was a great event here this past week. I want to talk about Missoula here for a moment, and then we're going to get you to your questions here and Q&A. I met with your city officials, county officials, your planning boards and so forth, teams. We talked about a build grant for Missoula. Now, they took me out to that area between West Broadway and Mullen, there on the west side. And you talk about the affordability, the housing affordability issue we have here in Missoula. I think 25% of the workforce here in Missoula, they told me, commutes from outside of Missoula County. And we've got to do something here to try to reduce the cost of housing. I see that problem in other communities like Bozeman across our state. So we're going to be working hard to get a $23.2 million grant, federal grant called the Build Grant, that would really have a breakthrough here to bring that connectivity. It opens up all that ground out there for housing, as well as helping just a little better north-south traffic flow. In Bozeman, it was always the east-west was our problem. Of course, here in Missoula, it's just that north-south traffic flow, just to build out more of that infrastructure. And I just want you to know we're working hard on that. And we've learned some of the tricks of how you get those things done. We got the Kalispell project done, the Tossin Overpass project. They're constructing now as you speak. When you're driving from Helena down to Three Forks, you know that horrible bend across the Missouri? When if there's a semi-truck coming, you kind of close your eyes and hope as you make that turn. That's now going to be a beautiful 4-lane bridge. In fact, I was sitting there watching them drive some of the pylons in just last week. And we got that accomplished, some of these grants. So we're planning to prioritize that Missoula grant and see if we can get that done here for Missoula. So I'm cautiously optimistic here to work that process. I'll look forward to working with. I saw Dave Dave, we had a nice chat about that as well. So we get this thing done here for Missoula. Just lastly, and we, sure, come on up. On the, in terms of accountability issues in Washington, D.C., I think one of the frustrations many of us have is when a threat of a government shutdown is used as a negotiation tactic. We need to end government shutdowns. And there's some good legislation out there trying to get bipartisan cooperation on that puts the pain back on the members of Congress if they can't get a budget passed. Think about that. In the state of Montana, we are required to balance a budget and get it done in time, or they don't let the legislature go home. We should adopt a similar process in D.C. that says if D.C., first of all, we wouldn't even allow it if they passed the September 30th deadline. You just would lock the funding in from the current year so that it would be seamless. But we wouldn't allow members to leave Washington, D.C. That would cure it pretty fast, I think. It truly would. And that's one of the bills we're looking at. And also, having spent 20 years in the private sector, the first bill I introduced was simply no balanced budget, no pay. If you can't pass a balanced budget, you shouldn't get paid. Hit the members of Congress in their pocketbooks. The state of Montana is required to do it. Most states require that. The federal government does not. And there's a reason we're staring at $22 trillion of debt right now. But it would help if we had some more accountability, frankly, to require, first of all, just to get a budget passed. And on top of that, a budget that actually achieves balance. So anyway, thanks for your attention. And I guess I'll turn back over to Peggy here. And I very much look forward here to engaging more and taking your questions. You bet. That was great. Yeah.
Okay, so now we take time for table talk, and that means all of you at your individual tables need to first introduce yourselves quickly, if you haven't already, to one another, and then we'll ask each table to come up with one question for our speaker. I ask that question be on topic and be short, if we can get through as many tables as possible before our 1 p.m. closing deadline. So we're going to take, I'm going to take 7 minutes instead of 10. So that means you have to talk a little faster, like you set your podcast at 1.5 speed. But come up with one question and then I'll reconvene the group. Okay, we're going to get started with the next portion of the forum. So I'm sorry to cut the discussion off, but we do want to give the opportunity to as many tables as possible. So again, I would ask that we have one question from the table, have a spokesperson ready we'll ask that you raise your hands. I have 3 people, Jim, Brett, and Dave, once I give him my mic, who will roam the room. I ask again, as a former longtime journalist, I know about those double-headed questions. Just one question. And I'd also respectfully ask the senator to be brief in your answers so we can get to as many tables as possible. And with that, I am going to give Jim the opportunity to let Mayor Dan Kemmis ask the first question.
Thank you, Senator, for visiting us and for a very informative presentation. I especially appreciated what you had to say about your efforts at bipartisanship. We know how difficult that is in Washington and how many strong incentives to act in a partisan way there are. I think part of the reason we're proud of City Club is because it regularly gets people together across partisan and ideological lines to talk about how we can do a better job of living together in Missoula, and I think we do pretty well. Are there ways that something like City Club or other organizations could do more to support you and your colleagues in acting for the common good over partisanship?
Yes. Is that brief enough? Okay. Thank you, Mayor. The answer is yes. And in today's world, increasingly, we're running to either our red TV or our blue TV, our red radio or our blue radio, our red print media source or our blue. Do you have the hand mic there? Is it working okay? It's kind of cutting in and out. Just a minute. Can you hear okay there? Okay. And the problem, we're living in our own echo chamber sometimes, which is a problem I see in this country. You remember Chet Huntley? He was born in Cardwell, Montana. High school in Whitehall. Went to Montana State for a couple years and finished up his schooling in Seattle. You go back and look at the journalism back when he signed off to come build Big Sky in 1972. Look at what it was Brinkley and Cronkite and Huntley. The way they reported the news back then, it was not editorializing, it was just reporting the facts. And consequently, the concern I have is that friendships are being lost. I see it in my own life, where I will have friends that were Democrat friends. I grew up the son of a Democrat. And it's not a good thing for this country. It truly isn't. And so the more we can facilitate civil back and forth dialogue, the better off we're going to be as a country, truly. To find formats where we can sit and have a civil conversation versus screaming and shouting. That's on both sides right now. It's not conducive. Once upon a time, senators were accountable to their state legislatures until the 17th Amendment in 1913. The world has changed, certainly. And anyway, there's a lot more to say on that, but the answer is yes.
Thank you, Senator Daines.
I can hear you. And make sure you tell me your name, too, please.
My name is Erin Clark. Thank you for being here today, Senator Daines. Our group talked about and acknowledged the fact that our federal agencies are severely underfunded, particularly agencies such as the Forest Service and the National Park Service. So we applaud your efforts with the Parks Act. We also wanted to check in with you in regards to a local solution that addresses public lands and economic health that was built right in the Sealy Lake and Ovando areas, which is known as the Blackfoot Clearwater Stewardship Act, which provides for additional protections for public lands, as well as creating strong outdoor recreation economies here in our communities, and wanted to understand where you are in terms of supporting that locally created effort that's important to our communities.
So these collaborative efforts, like the Blackfoot Clearwater and others, are some of the best in Montana. The Heritage Act was another example of that, by the way, right? In fact, some of these collaborative timber projects are some of the best examples here in Montana of working together, to the point that the mayor just brought up. We literally bring together conservation groups and neighbors and agencies and industry to come together with a solution. And the problem we'll have is we'll move forward with something like that, and then we'll end up with a litigation coming from, frankly, extreme interests that don't represent the vast majority of Montanans that will stop, whether it's timber projects and other kind of projects. On Blackfoot Clearwater, we're engaged, looking forward to continue to work on it and find a path forward here that could see. I think they're going to probably have to bring, anytime you move something forward in Washington, D.C., I've learned this, is that usually in a standalone fashion, it takes more than that. You got to figure out a way here to get some give and take on some other legislation to get that actually across the finish line. I've got some ideas on that. More to come. You bet. By the way, I was bear hunting on public lands outside of Ovanda earlier this spring, so it's great country.
Sounds good. Mike Hopkins, representing House District 92 here in Missoula. I represent a district that deals with a lot of forest fires. So you might remember the Rice Ridge Fire and the Liberty Fire from 2017. We have a lot of conversations here in the state about how we deal with that, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what yourself and folks in D.C. have been talking about, not just how we address fires when they start as quickly as possible, right, so we can get resources on them, but also in the off-season, how we treat to, at the very least, reduce the potential for severity of those fires.
Once upon a time, and in fact when I was going to high school, Libby was a AA school, Anaconda was AA, Columbia Falls was AA, Havre was AA, and Bozeman was one of the small AA high schools in the state of Montana. We had 30 active sawmills. Today we have 8. Either we are going to better manage our forests or our forests are going to be managing us. And how many of you have had situations, you're home in the summertime, your friends and family come from outside of the state, you want to show them the beautiful landscapes of Montana, and instead you've got your iPhone and you're showing them pictures of what it looks like on a clear day because you can't see the mountains. And it becomes an issue, and it's a health hazard for us in terms of the air we breathe. It's also an environmental disaster in the sense of what these wildfires do. You know, a forest is a great carbon sink. They absorb carbon. Wildfires emit CO2. Wildfires, post-wildfire, you've got erosion of the of your watershed and so forth. So it kind of goes on. And so there's some common sense things we can do here. I've been working with Amy Klobuchar as well. In fact, they're all running for president, aren't they? Amy's running for president on a Good Neighbor Authority bill as well. But wildfires do not respect boundaries. They don't come up, if they're burning on federal ground, they don't stop at the state ground or the private ground. And there's example after example in Montana. You can see we're doing it right and we're doing it wrongly. And oftentimes on federal land, we've got a lot of opportunity there. And one of the big challenges is serial litigation on timber projects here in Montana. That has got to change. And back on the Forest Service comment and funding, they're spending far too much time, effort, and dollars here, either defending litigation or getting ready to defend it, as well as fighting fires, instead of spending those resources there proactively managing the forest. And I don't fault the Forest Service. They're in the middle of this fight right now, as it relates to forest management. We can do better, and hopefully this bill with Diane, we can get that thing through here and signed by the President. Yes, I can.
I think he's over there.
That mic's dead, I think. I can hear it, but they can't.
Do you want to hold it?
Okay.
Hi. Thank you so much. So you talked a lot about meeting young folks before they were successful. Max Baucus, Bobby Houck Jr. I know all Montanans would love to see, the next Max Baucus, and they could even be in this room. However, more and more young folks are receiving threats of violence in social spaces, with the political divide being a driving force. And we saw this just recently in Montana during the national anthem. How do we prioritize engaging all young folks, regardless of their values, and allow them to voice those values while also ensuring their safety amid threats and act of violence?
Yeah. So you've asked a great question, and I think it's a question here as a nation we need to, first of all, as leaders, as strongly as we possibly can condemn hate and these acts of violence. These attitudes then are sometimes manifesting themselves into more violent acts, as we saw recently here in western Montana with that young boy, I think, and that other gentleman, I think it was from Mineral County. So it's going to take leadership to make sure that we are very clear and crisp in our condemnation of that. It's also ensuring we protect the First Amendment. Our founding fathers put the First Amendment first for a reason, to protect these freedoms that we have right here in this room. I mean, it's really amazing. I have a chance, as Peggy mentioned in my bio, we lived in China for 5.5 years. I was over there helping grow businesses for an American company to sell into that market. Let me tell you something. In China, you wouldn't have this going on today. We couldn't have dissent. They wouldn't have a leader coming out of their legislative branch where you all can ask whatever question you want and disagree with me as much as you want, and we can both walk out as free citizens. That protesters come out there and protest all they want. That's America. And we must protect free speech and freedom of the press and allow them to flourish in this nation. Our founding fathers had the wisdom to see that. That's why they put that as the First Amendment.
Okay, Senator Daines, I'm Peter Nielsen. Folks at our table certainly appreciated your words about bipartisanship and public lands protection. We certainly support full funding for Land and Water Conservation Fund and the Blackfoot Clearwater Act, which you've already addressed. But we ask, how can you remain silent on the appointment of a new BLM director who has, throughout his career, supported the sale of our public lands?
Yeah. Well, so he'll receive a hearing. He'll come through that process. By the way, he just recently, I think, in his acting role, just had a transfer of some state lands to the federal government, just signed off on it. And you have a director, the Secretary of Interior, David Bernhardt, who has been adamant in opposition of the transfer of federal lands to the state. Remember, if he were to be confirmed, he serves underneath the Secretary, who has been very clear without stuttering on this issue. And by the way, he can't unilaterally. He'll if there's anything on that too. If there's a significant transfer, he's going to have congressional authority to do that. Believe me. So I've been very clear for those of you in the audience too, on the opposing the transfer of federal lands back to the state. You can check my record on that without stuttering on that. So anyway, just want to be clear.
Hi, Senator Daines.
Yep.
My name is Jen Barilli. I'm the Resettlement Director for the International Rescue Committee. We are the refugee resettlement agency here in Montana. We're settling refugee families to Missoula. So I appreciate and echo what others said about stressing the importance of bipartisan work. And as I'm sure you know, the refugee admissions program historically, since it began in 1980, has been a bipartisan effort. Highest refugee resettlement numbers were under President Reagan. And so you may have heard that there are recent reports of actually reducing refugee admissions to zero this coming fiscal year as of October 1st. So I guess my question to you, since the safest way to enter the U.S. is as a refugee, it's a secure program, a life-saving program for vulnerable families. Mm-hmm. What is your response to those reports, and what would you bring to the administration to try to continue this life-saving program?
Yeah. So there's various ways to enter the United States. There are ways that are legal, and there are ways that are
illegal. We need to continue to have thoughtful dialogue in terms of setting the numbers and so forth of legal entrance into the country through legal immigration or through refugee status. I think the concern many of us have is the current laws, the way they are written, are actually incentivizing waves of illegal immigration into this country. And we've got to come together in Congress and address the law. When you see the outcomes of asylum seekers who are coming from Central America, where about 10% are adjudicated or through the hearing process as legitimate, said another way, 90% are not. What we have is a problem where you have individuals coming from Central America to our southern border, they're crossing, they're seeking asylum, and finding out 9 out of 10 of them are not legitimate claims. But when they get into our country, because we don't have a safe country agreement with Mexico and Guatemala like we have with Canada. See, if you were from Central America and tried to enter the United States from Canada, you could claim asylum, but then you would reside in Canada until your asylum claim hearing was completed. We need to change the law, and this is a prime example where Congress must come together, because here's what's happened. That's what they call the catch and release. They come into the country, they have to release within 20 days because of the Flores ruling, and then the backlog in the hearing process is 6 to 12 to 18 months. And they're lost into the system now in the United States, and they're making phone calls back to Central America saying, this is how you get in, through an illegal process. So there's some great stories of refugees who have done great things in this country, but it's through a legal process, not through illegal means. And that's a fundamental debate I think we need to have in this country, and to bring both sides together to fix the law so that future presidents can continue to enforce the law here without creating a humanitarian crisis, which we have right now on the southern border.
I'm Allison Cobb.
Hi, Allison.
Thanks for coming. It was good to see you.
Glad to be here.
So you've been opposed to measures of common sense gun control over the years. You ended up voting against the Fix NICS Act that you co-sponsored originally. But last week it seemed like you were softening towards red flag warnings. You stated that you're in discussions about legislation, and I don't believe you really want to enact any new legislation. I think you're hoping this will disappear and people will move on to other issues. Convince me that I'm wrong.
Sure. Happy to. This requires a thoughtful response. This is a very, very serious issue in our country. It's top of mind for many Montanans and Americans. By the way, on the Fix NICS and the School Safety Act, which was also, you didn't mention that, which we funded, the reason I voted against them, because it was part of a great big omnibus package that was a bloated spending bill. Not unlike the fact that both John Tester and I just voted against his recent budget cap. Would you accuse John Tester of being opposed to every federal program? Of course you wouldn't, because it was part of a larger package. So just to set the record straight, when you said I support the NICS, that's how that works sometimes. They get attached to a huge bloated budget bill. And for the sake of fiscal sanity and saving our children and grandchildren from shoulders and mounds of debt, that was explaining the vote to you anyway. So now let's get to your question about the issue of safety. After the Parkland shooting, I was invited to come down to the White House and discuss this with President Trump. I spent time talking to Marco Rubio, of course, the senator from Florida, it happened in his state, as well as Bill Nelson. I started looking at every school shooting that we'd had since Columbine, which is 1999. And they define a mass shooting as three deaths or more. So that's what I use as my cutoff in looking at the history of this violence. Here's my concern, is that members of Congress will want to message out to their respective constituents that we're doing something that indeed won't do anything to actually make our communities safer or our schools safer. If you look at the actions proposed, whether it's red flag, which I'm not planning to support the red flag piece, to be clear on it. I'm not planning to support the expanded background checks, at least as I've seen them today. I'm willing to go back and look to see what might be changed, but what I've seen here is not going to make our communities safer. Here's the problem we've got. I think you've got to take a look at the evil. And I had a debrief from Director Wray of the FBI on Wednesday, a long conference call with him with some other senators, where the director of the FBI gave senators over the phone, I was somewhere in Montana on my cell phone when he gave me the brief, a brief of what happened in El Paso. We have 100 FBI agents right now in El Paso, Texas, investigating this. That is a capital crime. Remember, that shooter was captured. It's going to be prosecuted probably as domestic terrorism, as a capital crime. This was a white supremacist bigot that was very clear on his intentions with the manifesto he published before he committed his horrible, horrible crime. In Dayton, it was the Dayton police force that engaged that shooter within 20 seconds and killed him within 10 seconds. Probably saved a lot of lives there in Dayton, Ohio. You contrast what happened in Dayton, Ohio, to what happened in Parkland, Florida, where the school resource officer in Parkland ran away from those students who were at the mercies of a killer, to the Dayton police force that advanced to the killer and took him out. The Dayton killer had published, when he was in high school, you've seen the reports, a kill list and a rape list. He made a threat to that high school earlier where about 1/3 of the students didn't show up to school one day because they thought he was going to come and shoot the school up. Something is wrong in our criminal justice system when you have a 16-year-old or a 17-year-old who are not adults who are making these threats and not being held accountable for them. It's one thing hey, we raised 4 children in Bozeman. It's one thing to have an MIP, or you have things that happen growing up in a high school that we say that's part of growing up. It's quite another when they make these threats of kill lists and rape lists and threaten to shoot up a school. The question becomes, should we be looking at that as a record in the system here that carries on into adulthood? Is not expunged when they turn 18. Because as you know, if you are convicted of a felony and serve year, you can't purchase a firearm. But here's the other problem, that if you look at what happened with these individuals, they usually aren't going through the normal process of getting the firearm. So we come back to this issue where they're going to put more laws in place that will not fundamentally make us safer, because the folks, thousands of Montanans, every day lawfully exercise their Second Amendment right. But the guys are hell-bent on doing these shootings. Will find a way to do it. Here's the Virginia Tech shooter, for what it's worth, the greatest mass shooting in our country's history, 33 killed, 2007. That was done with 2 pistols. So when somebody has intent on evil, we've got to get back to the core issue here. What's going on in the heart and the head? And one last contrast on Parkland. That Parkland shooter, everybody knew who that shooter was when he started to shoot. You ask those students. I've met with some of the students there from Parkland, Florida. They all knew who it was when he started shooting. We had several opportunities to stop that guy, and it didn't happen. Contrast that to Ravalli County, Montana, where there was a young man who posted a threat. And by the way, it is a crime to post a criminal threat on social media. That is a felony. There was a young man who posted a threat on social media, And the students and the teachers and the administration, to their credit, they engaged the Ravalli County Sheriff, Steve Holton, and guess what they did? They went down to Darby and they arrested him. That's the kind of proactive leadership that we need to stop some of these horrible, horrible acts of evil. There's a lot more to talk about this. I know this is it's a heart-wrenching, there's different views on this. But I take a look at what is Congress proposing, and then look at through the lens, go get the spreadsheet of all the mass shootings, use Columbine perhaps as the line to draw, and ask yourself, if this would have been put in place, would it have prevented this shooting?
What's the fix? How do we fix it?
Children are dying.
Yeah.
Our kids are dying for 4 hours last year. She was in a lockdown.
No, I'm happy to talk about that. Absolutely. So we took a look at the school situation that happened in Parkland. One of the fixes was providing federal funds for our schools to harden these targets. In other words, to make sure we have adequate systems in place here to stop them from getting in. That was one of the fixes. Anyway, there's good intentions out there. The question is, will it actually keep our kids and community safe? That's the question we have to ask ourselves on this. So that, not suggesting anybody does nothing. Please, with all due respect, we should do something, but do something that actually makes them safe. What I've seen so far would give us false hope that we've done something here. We've got to get to the deeper issues here. What's going on is producing these absolute evil killers.
Yeah. Please sit down. Please sit down. I need to close the forum right now.
Our climate is in crisis.
Here's what I would like to do. First of all, I want to thank all of you in the audience for your passion for public discussion. We have a lot more to discuss and hear. It's obvious today, but we are past our closing time. So first, I would like to thank the Senator for his time. And then, as I always do, I like to give a shout out to MCAT because they record all our forums. So if you ever want to watch this one or another one, please go to mcat.org. I also want to remind you Monday, September 9th, where we will have a City Club forum on enrollment and recruitment strategies. And we do expect another large crowd at that, so I urge you to buy your tickets early at cityclubmissoula.com. And please enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you for coming.